Welcome. My name is Liz Pavetta. I am the Instruction and Outreach Librarian. And today's Citation Station, we're going to be talking about an introduction to APA or the citation style from the American Psychological Association. So this is going to be a very brief introduction to it. I'm not going to be able to go in depth and cover quite everything in a 45-minute session. I'm also just going to be focusing on citations. I'm not going to be focusing on format of the paper or unbiased language or anything like that. This is pretty much strictly about the citations, but we are going to cover in-text citations, the elements of the references, as well as what the reference list should look like. We're going to talk about some of the different categories of sources, look at some examples of common source types, and then I'll leave you with some resources as well. There is also an interactive portion of this, so watch out for that a little bit later on. All right. Okay. So the style was initially developed in 1952. And the 7th edition has come out in 2020. And the 7th edition is a much updated version to kind of really look at digital sources and focus on things like unbiased language and that kind of thing. But the digital sources are probably the biggest addition to the style. Like previously, you had to really kind of work within the 6th edition manual to kind of figure out how you should cite a style. So citations are called references in APA, and basically they are how you identify the original source of an idea or a phrase, and again, how you can kind of communicate with your audience or your reader as to how you find that source. And these references are kind of put in two parts. One is the in-text citation, and the other is the reference in a reference list. Okay. So let me move on here. And then, the publication manual has a number of chapters that you should be looking at. And those are chapters 8 through 11. 11 is a little bit of a kind of add-on for legal citations, but really most of the content that is available in the APA manual is actually going to be additionally used on the APA style website under their grammar guidelines. So a lot of what I'm going to be referring to is actually coming from their official website, not necessarily the manual. Okay, so just a note, in the upper corner here, in the little purple box, I'm going to be listing out where this information is coming from directly within the manual. I'm going to try to be as specific as I can with chapter and even chapter sections. And then I'm also, if there is a website that is linked in APA style, I'll also be putting that up there too. So let's start off with in-text citations because they're a little bit easier and they're pretty simple to or simpler than the full reference list. So APA is an author date citation system, which means that you're going to be using the author and date within the sentence, not necessarily as a footnote or an endnote. So there's no superscript involved. And these in-text citations can either be parenthetical. So when you're not using the creator's name in a sentence, you're just putting that name within a parentheses, followed by a comma, and then the date of publication. Or they could be narrative. And this is when you actually are using the author's name in a sentence. So like either as a subject or kind of referring to them that way. In that case, you're only putting the publication date in those parentheses. Those in-text citations should be in pretty much the same sentence as the paraphrase or the direct quotation is used. And the format of these in-text citations is pretty much standard across the different categories of sources, whether that's, a text source or an audiovisual source or data or an online source. They're pretty much standard. So there is a little bit of formatting. The only kind of difference that format comes within the types of authors or the number of authors that are coming in. So you can have multiple sources in one set of parentheses. So like when you're summarizing a point and multiple studies are kind of saying the same thing. You can even cite specific parts of a source. So if you really want to direct somebody to where this information came from a source, you could include page numbers, for examples. And sources can also have multiple authors or even group authors as well. And how those are kind of put together comes through this little handy dandy chart that is in chapter 8 of the manual. And we've got a question. Yes, Anita.
So question for you is that, I went by the format and there are times where I see the title is italicized, but then my professor changed it and it was not italicized. So
We'll
I
we'll get into the titles
okay,
in a little bit. That we're just focused on in-text citation right now, which you
gotcha,
shouldn't have the title unless the title is like what there is no author. Okay.
gotcha.
So
Okay.
we'll get into that in a little bit. And the italicization kind of depends on the type of source it is. So we'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. So in-text citations, pretty cut and dry. There's a little bit of variation, again, depending on what the author is, but for the most part, fairly simple, right? Now, references are definitely a little bit more complicated because there's more information in them, because they're longer, and they have, some type of sources that you're using. But there are 4 elements that every reference should include or try to include. So the author, or who is responsible for the source, the date when it was published or created, the title, so what the actual thing is that you're citing, and the source is where this information is coming from. Okay. And so these kind of 4 sections are divvied up in this lovely diagram that again came directly from the manual, as well as the style grammar guidelines on the APA style site. And they tried to kind of pull out and show you the different areas of this. So in this example, you'll notice that the first is always going to be the author, and then followed by a date. Then you have the title of the individual article that you're looking at. And then that is followed by the source. And the source is probably the most complicated part of a reference because it has the most information in it. And we'll get into a little bit of that later on, but typically it's the source is going to be kind of the biggest, or I guess like at the broadest area where you can find that source. So whether that is coming from a publisher, or in this case, it's a journal article from the journal, the developmental psychology. And then it has more specific information about like which volume, which issue, page numbers. And then typically most sources that you're going to be using today are digital in some way. So you should be ending with that URL or a DOI. Okay. The other thing to note is that between these 4 different elements, you have a period that kind of separates out those elements. And that's why those periods are there. They're kind of like a stop. So like, okay, this is where the author stops. This is where the date stops. This is where the title stops. And then APA doesn't want you to put a period at the very end of a reference, especially after a URL or a DOI, because that might mess up the address that you're trying to go to. Okay. So if there is a DOI or URL, you're not going to use that. And then if there are any kind of separate parts within these elements, that's when you're going to see commas or parentheses. Okay. And where those kind of exist varies a little bit depending on what the source is. Okay. But 4 different elements separated by periods kind of make up this citation or this reference. So let's talk about the author element, right? So an author is the person, people, or group responsible for the creation, that publication of that work, okay? They're going to be listed by the last name, the surname first, and then followed by a second and possibly a first initial, especially if it's a individual author, an actual person. If it's only one author, it's pretty cut and dried. If there's two authors, you're definitely going to list both of them and then combine them with an ampersand, a symbol called an ampersand. But then over two authors, there's a couple of different things you can do. And this is again in that author element, in a reference, not necessarily an in-text citation. But you are actually going to list up to 20 authors in a reference. And you're going to list them in the order that they appear in the publication. So if someone named John Smith is listed as the first author, they need to come first, even if their co-author's name is John Adams, for example. Okay, it's always going to be in the list in the order that they are listed on the publication. Okay, now if you have more than 21 authors, which is rare, but it does happen, especially in a lot of science, like physical and natural sciences. Sometimes there's a lot of people working on a project. If there are 20 more or more, you're going to list up to 19 names. You're going to add an ellipsis or like 3 little periods, no ampersand, and then add the final author's name. And again, there's a lovely chart on in the manual on this in chapter 9. It's also online as well, but it didn't really fit well in a slide, so I had to kind of list it out. And then with a group author, this is going to be typically, you'll see this a lot with governmental organizations or kind of nonprofit organizations, and you're going to treat basically the whole name of the organization as a last name, and you're going to spell it out. And you're going to, especially with government departments, you're going to try to be as specific as possible. So, for example, the National Institute of Nursing Research is actually a sub kind of organization under the National Institutes of Health, which is also a sub institute under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, but the actual department that you're going to use as an author is going to be that most specific National Institute of Nursing Research. That other information is going to come a little bit later in the source. So, but for the group author, you're going to use the most specific group or organization that you can. Sometimes it's not that complicated. Like if it's the American Cancer Institute, for example, they're kind of their own entity, I think. Don't quote me on that. But if they're their own entity, or like, the Association of American Retired Persons, AARP, you would use them there. Okay. The other thing to note is that unlike in an in-text citation where you can kind of abbreviate or make their name or make a group author into an acronym after its first use, which I think was here. Yes. So this bigger one down here. So when it says National Institute of Mental Health, they abbreviated it, and in subsequent citations, it's NIMH. Okay. In an in-text citation, you can do that. In a reference, in the reference list, you cannot do that. It always has to be spelled out. Okay. All right. So the author element comes first. Then you're going to come with the date element. So the publication date is going to need to be as specific as you can make it. And including this is updated dates. So if an online source has been updated and it's actually listed, you'll need to use that. But publication dates, again, kind of depend on how, depend on the source that's being published, right? So most of the time you'll just see a year. This is going to be the kind of the standard, and the basic one, or the most basic that you can get is just the year of publication. Sometimes for things like news sources, you might actually get a year, a month, and a date. So for something that was published yesterday, you would need to put 2022 October 30th. Okay. Sometimes, especially with journals and periodicals, there might be it either coming out in a month or like a season. So you might see 2021 winter. And then if you have an author that has multiple works published in the same year, you're actually going to use kind of a lowercase letter A, B, C, D, so on and so forth, to kind of differentiate between those different dates. Okay. Now, if you can't determine the date, a lot of web pages don't have a date listed or really easily found. You can say that, okay, with the notation N period D period, standing for no date. And this is something that APA has done a lot with, is to try to help you kind of navigate what to do if there's missing information. I'll show you a little bit of a table later on that gets into that a little bit more. Okay. The last bit of a possible date element is called a retrieval date. And these really only need to be used for sources that are kind of designed to change over time, which is why you will see them with a lot of web pages. But this retrieval date comes a little bit later in the source element. I just wanted to put a point here. You won't use it retrieved in that initial date style. Okay. All right. So the title element is going to refer to, again, the title of the work that's being cited. And these kind of are put into two different sections. Either it's going to be standalone, so it is the whole book, the whole film, a whole report, a website, or a dissertation. These are some examples. Or it's going to be kind of part of a greater work. So this is a book chapter, a journal article, a podcast episode, a reference work entry. And the format, you're going to use the sentence case, meaning that you capitalize the first word of a subtitle, which typically comes after a colon, any proper nouns or acronyms. Okay, everything else should be undercase. You're going to italicize a standalone title. So if you are referencing, for example, the book, we're just going to pick on To Kill a Mockingbird, right? To Kill a Mockingbird is a novel. It's a standalone work. There's no kind of subsequent chapter in it that you might want to cite. So you'd italicize To Kill a Mockingbird, okay? But if it's a journal article, right, the journal article does not stand alone. And so in that case, you are going to be leaving it unitalicized, and you'll italicize the title a little bit later on in the date. Okay. And then you're going to use, the other thing that you might see in a title element is that sometimes there's going to be some brackets that come after the title. And this is to help identify sources that are kind of outside the kind of commonly used peer-reviewed or scholarly sources. So you won't necessarily see this with a journal article or a book, but you will see it with audiovisual sources. You will see this with software or policy briefs, unpublished manuscripts, okay? And it's really just to help identify like kind of clue other people into the fact that this is not necessarily a textual work that you're looking for, or it's a really specific type of source, okay? All right, now the last element here is going to be a source is going to be the source, okay? And this is, again, where you can find the work that is being cited. If it's a standalone work, like To Kill a Mockingbird, you're going to include, the publisher, or maybe if it's a web page coming from that National Institute of Nurse Research, then you would, come back with that larger organization like the National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, okay? If the title was part of a greater whole work, then the source element is going to be that greater whole work. And that's the title of the edited book, the journal title, the podcast series, the title of that encyclopedia, okay? There is a lot of variety in source formatting, and it really depends on the reference type, whether or not something is italicized here. Typically, if it is, the title, like an edited book or a journal, you're going to italicize it. But like if it's a standalone thing, like the publisher or the larger organization isn't necessarily going to be italicized. So if kind of like a way to think about this is if the title is part of a source, then you're going to italicize the title. But if the title is kind of stands on its own, then the source won't necessarily be italicized. And I'll show that what it means in a little bit. Couple of things to note that are just kind of in general good rules of formatting is that you're not going to include the name of like a research database or platform, typically as a rule, okay? This is because if you find a work through, say, PubMed is not the only database that resource might be found in. Or other people could go directly to the journal and not have to go through PubMed in order to find that source, okay? And along with that, the 7th edition took out a lot of the requirements for the location name. So for example, if a book is published by, say, Springer, and Springer has its offices in New York City, we don't really need to go to New York City to talk to Springer to get this book. We used to have to, or for some like smaller presses that are really locally sourced, you might want to include that. But for the most major ones, we don't need to know like physically where that place is anymore, okay? There are going to be some sources that are really associated with the location. So like where a conference was held, where an archive is. A lot of unpublished or informally published work will ask that you include that location, but for the most common sources, again, you're not going to include a location. And then the biggest thing to do to help, again, your audience find where these sources are is including either a URL, a web address, or a DOI, which is a digital object identifier, whenever possible. And so the thing that you're going to do with both of these is you're going to make them as specific and as simple as possible, okay? So for a website, for example, you're going to try to take out a lot of like the kind of reference kind of or a lot of the URL that like kind of tells you where you came from or like where you got to it. So looking for as simple URL as possible. You're also often not going to use the URL that is associated directly with a library resource. You're going to try to use that DOI because again, if you put a URL that links back to the Flint library, like and kind of has our proxy in it, then someone who's looking at your work from outside the University of Michigan Flint, if they click on it, they're not going to be able to log in to view that. Okay, so that's why we want to go try to be as simple as possible when we're getting those URLs or DOIs. We'll have some examples here in just a second. Okay. So the reference list, when you pull this all together, you're going to start on a new page and you're going to label the section references, okay? You're going to order by the author's last names or the group names, and then the date if you have multiple authors, or multiple sources by the same author. If there is no author, you're going to use the title in place of that author. And there's also some basic formatting that you've got a hanging indent, and then meaning that like the second, third, possibly fourth lines of a reference are indented about 1/2 inch. And then you're also going to format with double spacing within and between the entries. So pretty much every other line, you're going to have a space there. And to give you, and note on this missing information, you may not be able to find all of it, all the information that you need, okay? But again, APA has provided some guidelines on how to adapt the references if this is the case. So this is just the start of the chart. There's more to it. I was able to clip a little bit of it. But in chapters 9.43 and 9.52, that's where you're going to see this, as well as on that website that's listed here. But basically, like if the author is missing, then you're going to start with the title, then the date, and then go to source, okay? And in an in-text citation, it's going to be title year. If the date is missing, you're going to have N.D. to signify no date. if for some reason the title isn't available, like there is no real title there, then you're going to kind of describe the work in some way, but indicate that. And then it kind of, the table continues on down with other things that get a little bit more specific each and every time. But a lot of the time, the author and the date are going to be the things that you are missing most often. So those come up at the very top. Okay. So let's see what an example of the types of sources that you could be using. And this is what happens when, this is what you should first think about when you encounter a source is what type of source is this? And APA kind of groups them into 4 different types and then kind of splits those groups in to be more and more specific. So the groups that APA puts these into are textual works, dataset software and tests, then audiovisual works, then online media. Okay. So textual works is then kind of categorized down into things like periodicals, books and reference works, edited books and entries and reference works, reports and gray literature, conference sessions and presentations, dissertations and theses, reviews, and then unpublished and informally published works. Okay. And then it even goes even more specifically into the types of periodicals that you could see. So journal articles, newspaper articles, blog posts, editorials. Okay. And these categories and types exist under each and every single one of those groups. And those types kind of exist under each one of those different categories as well. So if you kind of have seen like a tree diagram before, that's often what you'll notice here. So let's take a look at an example list of references here. So in this case, this is what it should look like. Again, it is ordered alphabetically. So Dillard comes first, then Grady, then Harvard, then the National Institute of Mental Health. You'll see that there are some references that have multiple authors. There's a couple that you'll see. So for example, the one from Harvard University has the video in brackets because it's a YouTube video, right? And like the National Institute of Mental Health has additional source information because it's an organization within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health. Okay. So hopefully to help you kind of visualize this a little bit more, I've highlighted it so you can actually see where the authors are. So the authors are all going to be in purple. The dates are in blue. The title of the book or the title of the entry or the article or the web page is going to be in yellow. And then finally in green, you have the source. So the source is always going to be kind of the most, the longest and has the most information in it. And you'll notice that none of them have that retrieved by date. Okay. Most of the time you're able to go in and either find kind of a stable URL or something that isn't going to be updated all that often or isn't supposed to change all that often. So Anita, to your in the chat here, you shouldn't really use the retrieve by date unless it is on a page that is going to change. So like change really often. So say, for example, it's a wiki article that you're referencing, or it's a page that you're going to be seeing updated quite a bit. Something like that might be there. But for the most part, you're not going to use the retrieve date.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So we're going to try this together. I've got 2 different sources that we're going to look at, and then we're actually going to use this worksheet that APA has developed to kind of aid us in putting this together. Okay. So let me pull up. I've got the worksheet here, and then you should also see then this page called General Principles for Reducing Bias. Everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So first off, we're going to start with the worksheet here. So the worksheet you can download from the APA site here, but basically it's going to ask you to find out if they're an author, what the author's name is. okay, for this particular work. So we're going to base this on the general principles for reducing bias, okay? Now, this is coming from the APA style site. There is no author kind of listed up at the top in like a byline or anything. And if I scroll down the page, I'm seeing more content about bias and being unbiased, and it's got some references, but then it comes all the way down here and there's no personal author, right? So what do we think, or what organization should we use for this particular site? Any guesses?
So it's still a textual work, but it's a blog.
So I would actually say that this is not a textual work, just because it is it's technically a website. Hold on a second. Let me find the thing here.
I just took it from that chart. That's a textual works.
Yeah.
And periodicals and then blog post.
Right. So in this case, let me actually take you back out here to the APA style and give you a little bit more context here. So the APA style it's actually just a website, right? It's not a blog, which is going to be kind of updated regularly with like new information, right? It's the APA style is supposed to be kind of a static page. And so again, the general principles for reducing bias, unless they're going to be updating this really frequently, which typically they aren't. And you'll even see that it says over here that this guidance is the same as in the 6th edition, right? So they haven't even changed this between the 6th and the 7th edition. So this is going to be a more static website, okay?
Does it say something at the very bottom about taken from blog post? Right there from the APA style blog. Oh, is this just another article? That's what threw me off.
So the APA style does have a blog, and they are updating it kind of regularly with things that are kind of new. So for example, when ChatGPT came out, they posted to that blog about how to reference how they would reference use of ChatGPT. Okay. So there is another style blog, but there's an APA style blog, but this page is not part of that blog, because actually you can even see up at the top, there's the link to the blog. Right? That's kind of outside the style and grammar guidelines. Okay. So I would classify this as basically a web page, okay, that has a group author, right? There isn't any person that's kind of assigned to this. So in this case, on the worksheet here, we'd probably put American Psychological Association. All right. Now let's see if we can find the date. Do you see it up at the top here?
I thought I saw it at the bottom.
Good. Yeah. So typically on websites like this, they're either going to be listed pretty close up to the top, or they're going to be listed down here at the bottom. Okay. And we do see that this has a last updated date. So we're probably going to need to use that last updated date rather than when it was first created. Okay. Because we want to be as specific as about what edition we're using, or like when it was last updated. So in this case, we're going to say 2022, July, because again, we want to use that specific date, and it's giving us that month that it was updated. So we want to include that month if at all possible. All right. And then when we go and we get to that title, so let's go up to the top here, look at the title of the web page. What do we think the title is on this page?
General Principles for Reducing Bias.
Okay. Now, do we think that this is part of a larger work, or does this kind of stand on its own?
I think it stands on its own.
Okay. So there is, it is kind of coming under this bias-free language section, and it is kind of coming under the style and grammar guidelines. Now, this is where one of those things where APA is a little bit ambiguous in some cases. Okay. Let me actually go on load. It's taking its sweet time. But APA is a little bit ambiguous about this. So it would kind of depend on how you want to sorry, I got distracted. I had a chat coming in from a colleague, sorry. Which is neither here nor there. But in this case, I would probably actually say that it stands on its own, especially if you really aren't able to get back to this kind of bias-free language, or if like the style and grammar guidelines is too broad. Okay. So in this case, we would do the general principles for reducing bias. Okay. And then the last bit is going to be this source, right? So if we're taking that as work that stands alone, okay, so the source is going to be the publisher of the work, the database, the archive, the social media, or the website, right? Plus any DOI or URL, okay? Then if you go down here, you're going to kind of provide the website name in title case without italics. And if the author is the same as the website name, you're going to omit the website name from the source, end with URL. And again, in most cases, do not include a retrieval date. So I really like this worksheet because it kind of breaks it down for you, especially if it's a site that has a little bit of you're not sure what it is, those kind of things. So in this case, where we go. So again, we shouldn't use the American Psychological Association again, because it has that, because we're using that as the author, right? So in this case, we'd probably actually just grab this full website URL and pop that in there, okay? And then again, you'd kind of copy and paste everything down into your work here.
And you said this worksheet where you can pop in things like that is available to us on the website?
Yes. And then I'll take. Okay, and again, we have like let me see if I can actually italicize this. Can I? It's not okay. So it's not letting me italicize this because it's in a PDF, but you would italicize the title here. Okay. So yes, this is actually available on the APA site. I'll show you where to download this pretty much, but like there's all these reference examples and reference handouts that it talks about, and it really breaks it down for you. Okay.
Okay, go back real quick to the title, General Principles for Reducing Bias. I noticed too that I think I saw this somewhere earlier where only the first word should be capitalized. Is that correct?
Good catch, Anita. Yes, you are right. So yeah, I was trying to trip you guys up there. Do some correction, but yes, exactly. So okay, again, if there was a proper noun later in there, you would use that proper noun and you would capitalize any like acronyms or anything. Or if, for example, we wanted to kind of add this in as like if we did want to be a little bit more specific, because again, this is coming under bias-free language. So if we wanted to kind of use that as the title, and then the subtitle is General Principles for Reducing Bias, we could, again, that first subtitle, the first word of the subtitle after the colon, that is going to be capitalized as well. Okay. Now, this lovely worksheet gives you a lot of information. It really does. It does not cover everything though. So always going either back to the physical manual or visiting the APA style website is going to be really helpful too. Okay. All right, let's try another one. Now this one might be a little bit easier. We'll kind of see. All right, so this is a journal article, or it's going to be a journal article that we found on the library's site. Okay. Now you can get a lot of information that you'll need up in this top area here. And then I'll also notice that there is 2 different databases that we could possibly get this full text access to. This is again why we're not adding that database name, because it is available. This journal is available outside of those individual databases or in multiple databases. So that's why you're not seeing it here. Okay. So let's actually see. And now in a lot of these library databases, you will actually get some help with the citation. Okay. Now, most of the time, they're pretty good. Okay, I mean, actually, most of the time they're pretty good. Okay. The one thing that I often see issues with tends to be some things with like these page numbers. These are like really long, and I would kind of want to check those to see what's going on there. Also make sure that like the Proceedings of the Royal Society .B Biological Sciences, if that is the actual name of the journal. Okay. So if it's like this, maybe we actually want to go into one of the databases here. So for example, in PubMed, to see, is this actually, you know, the information that's coming through, or even like downloading the full PDF to see what this looks like. And again, I like kind of going into JSTOR because it does actually give us more information, and it does actually tell us like, oh, the page numbers are there, right? So this really annoying long page number actually is the page number that they're using. So actually, no, it's not. Hold on. No, it's not. Oh, ha.
Right,
Yes.
I see another page number on the next pages. Like
yeah, so exactly. 2 is there. And so this 2016 111146 is something else. It's something weird. So that's not the page number, right? So
we
going
can take
in,
that out, right?
So we would take that out, yeah. So in this case, we would definitely kind of make sure, and like the page numbers here, 1 through 7, that's actually what we do see here. So again, there's a number 2 up here at the top, 3 all the way down to, hopefully this will load and it'll be number 7. Yeah. So those page numbers that were there in that initial kind of generated citation from the database was incorrect. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they try to do the best that they can, but not everything is going to be the best. But let's try to work on this a little bit here with our lovely worksheet. Okay. So for authors, we have individual authors here, right? How am I going to put in these authors?
I would think, well, first of all, it's the last name first, comma, first name, period, or first initial, period. And because there are more than 2 here, can you use et al or et al or whatever?
No.
Oh, you have to list them all. So
I have to list them all.
Gotcha. And then, yeah, that same thing, last name first, comma, first initial, period. That is so annoying.
It gets even more annoying when there are 19 to 20 authors, right? Like, again, it really is annoying, which is why, you know, a lot of the time, things like citation managers or other types of like the databases do try to help with that a little bit. Okay. Now in this example, there is an actual date here, right? So we'd have to do the whole date. Let's put this in the correct box. Excuse me. scroll down here. Right. So again, there is a specific date listed. The work of the title. What do we think the work of this title is, or the title of this work is?
Ocean acidification, ultras fish, jellyfish symbiosis. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is this a standalone, or is this part of a larger work?
I believe it's a standalone.
Okay. Is there anything on the database page that might say it's not?
I mean, the proceedings B makes me think there's a proceedings A, and this is part of a larger article.
Mm-hmm. Right. And actually even, so this is from the Proceedings of Biological Sciences, right? And even up here, it says journal article, right? Proceedings, Biological Sciences. Okay. So in this case, the source we got right. Okay. Or the title we got right. But then the source down here, we're going to need that kind of works that are greater part of the whole. So is the volume and issue number here, as well as either if it has a stable ID like this, we could possibly put it in as JSTOR. Okay. I would rather see a DOI, but not everything has a DOI. And apparently this one, there it is. You might actually have to look and say, oh, look, there's the DOI listed on the PDF of the article. And it's, for some reason, it's not in JSTOR. Okay. So again, creating these citations does take a little bit of time and effort to kind of put them together. And that is why sometimes, especially for larger projects, using the citation manager like Zotero or EndNote is really useful. But even there, I do see mistakes that come up. Okay. And
I'm not familiar with those two that you mentioned. Can you put website?
I will talk about that in just a second. Any questions before we head over to just like where general resources would help to leave you with?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure, Carrie.
So when you're doing, I'm sorry, I was a little late, plus I'm multitasking with it being Halloween.
Yeah.
When you're doing an in-text citation, when you're citing, like, an article that's from someone else, but it's, it's like a double cite.
So you are citing something, hold on a second. You're citing a source that was cited within something else.
Yes.
Okay. Hold on. It is, a lot of the times you're kind of, the way that you would list that out is like, as someone is cited, you'd actually like kind of list that or state that out in the sentence. And hold on a second. I just talked about this with someone else the other day.
I've actually been working with the writing center. We've been going over it for like the last 2-3 weeks because I noticed a lot of the quotes that I wanted to use have been from other authors. And I'm like, well, what are you doing? And they're like, I don't know. We have to look on Purdue. We have to look on APA. And it was kind of difficult.
Yeah, that is often really difficult to do. A lot of the time you're actually going to want to try to go back and find the original source. So going back and then citing that original source rather than referencing in or like citing in a particular or it's kind of stating that was cited within that paper. It's not coming up right away. I know I just saw it though. So I will email you with that information after this webinar because I know Halloween is like trick-or-treating is upon us right now. So let me look into this and then I'll email you, okay?
Okay. And then my other question, I'm not sure if you went over it or not, but when do you use page numbers in the text?
Okay. So page numbers or citing specific parts of a source, the reasons you kind of do this is
it when you quote things directly?
yeah, so that's the main part, and this is actually, I have it in front of me, section 8.28. And a lot of the times, if you want to provide them with exactly where this is. Most of the time, you can just get away with the date. You don't necessarily have to have that page number. But, and truthfully, most people don't, like, most of the time you aren't going to actually want to use the page number. But the only time that they really kind of recommend it is if you are doing a direct quotation of it. Yeah, so that's section 8.28 in the manual, and then as well as in where'd it go? It talks about it a little bit in 8.13. And one thing to remember with APA is that these are guidelines, right? They're not like hard and fast. Well, okay, the publication manual claims that it's not hard and fast rules. A lot of professors are going to treat them like they're hard and fast rules, but they're not, right? It's as long as you can get to that person the information where they're coming from and you're being transparent about the citation, that's typically what needs to happen. Okay. But are you clear on that, Carrie? Or did you need?
Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. So if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to leave you with some places to find help. So the APA style website or manual is the best place, obviously. The style and grammar guidelines on apastyle.apa.org is going to be a really good source of online stuff. We also have on the library's website here, this citation tools guide. It's listed under research help, okay? But we do have things like, we do have some citation managers. So EndNote and Zotero, we actually did some webinars on these earlier in the semester, and we have those, both of those webinars are uploaded onto our YouTube site. But on the citations tools guide, we do have the style guide page, and that has links out to APA style, the reference examples, and the style blog, which kind of has, you know, more up-to-date thing, or more up-to-date content sometimes, especially with like changing sources or things that are coming up in the news. Like, so my example earlier was when ChatGPT came out, they, you know, put a blog post out about how to cite the use of ChatGPT. So, but the APA style is a really great resource if you haven't actually been able to buy the manual, even though I think the manual was like $30 or so along that, but like the style and grammar guidelines, this is, they have how to format a paper, in-text citations, reference examples, bias-free language, all this kind of stuff in here. And this is again where I got a lot of the diagrams, a lot of the tables and everything that I found today was from this style and grammar guidelines. This is also where you can get information about putting together these references. So don't have it here, do they? Maybe it's under reference examples. Yeah. So there's like there's some related handouts here. So the common reference examples guide, the reference example guide, and even I think also under instructional aids, this is where you're going to see some of those other worksheets, including the one that I pulled today. They should be under instructional aids on this APA style site. Yeah, under handouts and guides, that's where it's going to be, where all of these different worksheets are that are going to be really useful.
Where did you find instructional aids? Sorry.
No, so this was on.
Oh, here it is. APA style.
APA style, it's right there. There's style and grammar guidelines, products, instructional aids. And this is where like subscribing to the newspaper is other things like in-text citations, reference lists, all those formatting things are all listed on this handouts and guides site under instructional aids. Thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Find upcoming webinars to register for at libcal.umflint.edu.